If the Bhagavat conception of God or the divine is true, then it's a pretty damn cool conception of God. Welcome to Audarya Vision, a podcast where we try to develop spiritual compassion as a vision, a consciousness of spiritual generosity, from the word Audarya. And we do that by connecting with two of the great classic yoga sacred texts of the ancient Sanskrit tradition, namely the Bhagavad Gita, considered to be the Bible of Hinduism, so to speak, as well as the Shrimad Bhagavatam, a gigantic text that's bigger than the Iliad and the Odyssey put together, and which describes itself as the ripened fruit of the tree of Vedic literature. So if you're into Indian philosophy, Indian philosophy, yoga philosophy, Vedic Sanskrit texts, Indian gods and goddesses, then you're in the right place. We're in this series, and thank you for being here. We're in the series where we're looking at the prayers of Queen Kunti. Queen Kunti being a main character in the Mahabharata epic. She's the mother of the 5 Pandava brothers, including Arjuna, the hero of the Bhagavad Gita. And in the first book, chapter 8 of the Shrimad Bhagavatam, there's these famous prayers by Queen Kunti. And so here I want to read yet another one, because they're all really just beautiful. And in this particular one, she's just basically describing what God is. I mean, she's speaking, according to the text, directly to God. She's speaking to Krishna, and she's like saying different things about him. And it's interesting because there's all sorts of stuff in this particular verse. And I think it's a great verse. It's a great prayer to meditate on, precisely because she covers so many different aspects of a personal conception of God, right? So here it goes. It goes like this: Namo kinchana vitaya nivritta guna vrittaye atmaramaya shantaya kaivalya pataye namaha. And the translation goes, my obeisances are unto you, who are the property of the materially impoverished. So if you've been following this podcast, we already saw that. She already mentioned that in one of the previous really famous prayers of hers, where she's saying, that only the materially impoverished, not necessarily those who are literally poor and literally uneducated and literally, come from a poor family or so-called aristocratic family, or have no education or are ugly, but those who are deep down in the heart, basically exhausted with the cycle of birth and death, and have come to grips have come to the conclusion that, you know what, I'm never going to be happy down here without being connected to God, right? So she already brought that up in the previous verse, so we're not going to go over that, but I just thought of making a connection to that. So she goes, you are the property of the materially impoverished. You have nothing to do with the actions and reactions of the material modes of nature. So here we're going to deal with the gunas, the 3 gunas. Those of you who do yoga, you've heard of sattva and rajas and tamas. And if you're into Ayurvedic medicine, and of course the law of karma, the actions and reactions and how these reactions work in the 3 modes. So you have nothing to do, she says, with the actions and reactions of the material modes of nature. You are self-satisfied. You are self-satisfied, and therefore you are the most gentle and are master of the monists. Master of the monists. What does that mean? So let's go over it. So the first point, or the second point, but the first one we already looked at. Kunti is saying that you have nothing to do with the actions and reactions of the material modes of nature. So there's these 3 modes, gunas, sattva, rajas, tamas, goodness, passion, ignorance, and they're sort of filters or influences or ropes, technically speaking. I mean, to use the Sanskrit word, the word guna means rope. And so these 3 influences influence everything and everyone in the material world. And for that, you have to go to the 17th chapter. The 14th chapter also speaks about that in the Bhagavad Gita. So you have, food that's influenced by the mode of passion, food influenced by goodness, food influenced by, darkness or ignorance, charity in the 3 different kinds of modes, happiness in the three different kinds of modes, So for example, pleasure or happiness that is derived from the contact of the senses with their objects, with the epitome being, sexual pleasure, is considered by Krishna himself in the Bhagavad Gita to be happiness that's influenced by the mode of passion, and which is characterized by pleasure at the beginning and sorrow or suffering at the end, right? So there's a whole, sort of very scientific breakdown of these three modes of nature. And so these three modes of nature are also intertwined with the concept of action-reaction, right? When you give charity or when you eat or when you do anything, it's called karma. So then you have, the karmic reaction, and based on what kind of mode was influencing that action, you'll get a reaction, a fruit, right? A karma phala, a fruit of your action that's also sort of corresponding in terms of the three modes of nature. But here, Queen Kunti is establishing the premise that, or the declaration that God, by definition, has nothing to do. He's like totally not material. There's nothing. There's not a tinge of the three modes of nature with God. Like God is totally beyond the three modes of nature, right? As a matter of fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, God or Krishna says, "Daivyesha gunamai mama maya duratyaya," that mameva ye prapadyante mayamitam tarantite, that the three modes of material nature, these three gunas are very difficult to overcome, but one who surrenders unto me, one who takes shelter of me, can transcend them, can easily overcome them. So if surrendering or taking shelter of God, facilitates or enables you to transcend the three modes, then logically he can't be under these modes, right? The next point, you are self-satisfied. You are self-satisfied. So God, by definition, or at least by Kunti's declaration, doesn't depend on anything or anyone to feel satisfied or to feel happiness, right? Whereas we do. I mean, we even, in our pure state, our souls in their pure state need to be connected in service, in love with God. And by doing so, then they become self-satisfied. But their self-satisfaction, in a very real sense, depends on satisfying their very root, or their very origin, which is God. So individual souls like you, like me, are never really like fully autonomously self-satisfied. Only God is. Like God doesn't depend on anything or anyone to be completely satisfied. We depend on God to be fully satisfied, right? And therefore, Queen Kunti says, you are the most gentle. Isn't that interesting? You are the most gentle. Have you ever noticed, like, when you, at least I can speak for myself, when you kind of when let's say you break the four regulative principles, like for those of you who understand this notion of four regulative principles, meat, eating, gambling, illicit sex or sex outside of marriage, and ideally procreation, intoxication, eating, gambling, and intoxication. I just ate, so my brain is not very irrigated with blood. Sorry. Meat eating, gambling, intoxication, and illicit sex. So when you engage in one of those four activities, or all four, if you're on a streak, the reaction is that your consciousness is not so gentle. You even surprise yourself at how much you like bite back, or you're intolerant or impatient, or you get angry really fast, or you become irritable. So that's for us. Now, why is Kunti talking about here? Why is she referring to God being, most gentle, and as a result of having nothing to do with the reactions of material nature? You see, having nothing to do with the three modes of nature, because the three modes of nature are really the ones that push us to be not gentle. But by definition, pure goodness or transcendence, which is the stuff of the spiritual world, which is the stuff that makes up God, and actually the stuff that makes up us as souls, namely, Chit and Ananda, or, eternal bliss, eternal knowledge. That stuff, that spiritual stuff, is totally gentle, totally sweet. My friends at Wisdom of the Sages, Raghunath and Kaustubh, they have this extra special program called, what is it? Sweet Baby Krishna, right? Sweet baby Krishna, like God as a really gentle, sweet baby, right? So it's really cool that Queen Kunti is calling God, most gentle. And then she says, you are the master of the monists, which is really cool. The monists are the non-dualists, the followers of the Advaita Vedanta school, those who claim that there is no difference whatsoever between the individual soul and God, that we are 100% God and God is 100% us, and it's just a question of meditating long enough and realizing that ultimately we're all one, right? So that type of propaganda, which was started by Shankara Acharya, the founder of the impersonal school, that type of idea is very sort of antagonistic towards transcendental dualism, or the notion of achintya bheda bheda tattva, inconceivable oneness and difference, as you find in the Bhakti tradition, where we are one, granted, in quality with God, but ultimately we are also different, eternally so. Like God's God, and we're little parts and parcels, little souls who serve God, via bhakti yoga, and who receive love from God. So it's interesting that she says, you are the master of the monists, because you see elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Bahunam jantmanam ante jnanavam prapadyate. Vasudeva sarvamiti samahatma sudurlavaha. He says, after many births and deaths, one who is actually in knowledge surrenders or takes shelter of me, knowing me to be the cause of all causes and all that is. And then he adds, such a great soul is very rare. So the idea is that, you can go on, denying the personal element, the personal aspect of God for lifetimes. You can deny that God's a person. You can deny Krishna, basically, or Vishnu, for millions of lifetimes, and you can even come up with like a really sophisticated theological system of illusion. The whole Advaita Vedanta monistic idea of non-dualism, where ultimately we think there's a duality, but actually there's none. We're all just one, and we should just stop talking, because even language is a thing of duality, blah 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 blah, right? So here Queen Kunti is basically saying, you can do that all you want for as many lifetimes as you want, but one day, one fine day, and hopefully sooner than later, because you don't want to reincarnate too many times in this pretty nasty material world. One fine day, you end up taking shelter. You end up surrendering to the personal God, understanding that the impersonal stuff, is an emanation, that Brahman emanates from him. So it's not like the impersonal realization all of a sudden goes down the tube or goes down the toilet, but it's just realizing that this impersonal white light, so to speak, that everyone, all the non-dualists are trying to identify with and merge into, are actually the bodily rays of the spiritual body of God. So when you come to that realization, then you realize that Vishnu or Krishna or the personal God is the master, and you're not. So she says that, I love that, you are the master of the monists, because even the monists, after many, 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 many lifetimes, if necessary, eventually, sooner or later, make it to taking shelter of God, right? So I recommend you read these verses by Queen Kunti. You can, order this book on the Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Gita in hard copy. I recommend you go to vedabase.io, and there you've got all of these books with the commentaries by Prabhupada. They're available, and read them on a daily basis. It'll keep you very strong spiritually, right? And in the case of this particular verse, well, you can just remember that ideally deep down in the heart, you have to be, thirsty and hungry for God's mercy. You have to be materially impoverished, not necessarily explicitly or actually, you can be a millionaire and yet inside be craving for God and be a great devotee of God. And you should remember that, even though we talk about Krishna or Vishnu, he has nothing to do with karma and with the three modes of nature. And as a result, or parallel to that, he's self-satisfied. He's completely self-satisfied, and therefore by nature he's the most gentle. He's the most gentle, and he's your best friend. You should remember that Krishna says in the Gita, Bhoktaram yagatapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suridam sarvabhutanam. I'm the best friend of all living beings, like the closest to the heart kind of best friend, bosom, more than buddy, bosom brother, kind of thing, or sister. So he's the best friend. So remember that, and finally, feel lucky that you're tasting this personalistic concept of Hinduism or of yoga philosophy, where the personal aspect of God, takes precedence, and you can engage in a personal relationship with God, which is what like the Christians talk about all the time. Do you have a personal relationship with Christ? So the idea of a personal relationship with a person, you can only have a personal relationship with a person. You can't have a relationship with an it, or with a formless, personality-less blob of consciousness. So we're really lucky. We're really lucky to be able to connect with this beautiful Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita, and we should continue doing this on a daily basis, and also accompany that with chanting of God's names, whether it's gospel or chanting different names of Krishna, in particular the Hare Krishna mantra. That will keep us as happy as possible in this life, in this transitory life, and that way we can just make progress steadily and be a good example for others in the world. Thank you for listening. Take care. Om Tat Sat.